The 911 emergency line is a sacred tool for people in their darkest hour. It's also, apparently, a customer service hotline for cold French fries, judgmental pets, and ugly Tinder dates. We've compiled 101 stunning examples of people using this critical service for the most unbelievably stupid reasons ever recorded. Prepare to have your faith in humanity permanently damaged. 1. Imagine being so convinced of your neighbor's godlike powers that you actually call the cops to report a secret weather machine. A man in Washington was certain his neighbor was making it rain, specifically to ruin his newly washed car, and demanded a full tactical raid to seize the device. Apparently, checking a weather app was too much work for this amateur scientist. 2. Most bank robbers try to get away, but this genius called 911 to complain that the ATM was taking way too long to count his money. He wanted an officer to come down and speed up the machine so he could get to his lunch reservation on time. The only thing the police expedited was his trip to the station for wasting their time. 3. A parent in Ohio called 911 because their toddler looked at them with too much attitude during a timeout. They wanted an officer to come over and teach the 3-year-old about the legal consequences of being disrespectful to authority. The dispatcher had to explain that the police department doesn't provide specialized discipline for grumpy toddlers. 4. A woman called emergency services because her local grocery store refused to sell her a single grape for half price at the produce stand. She claimed this was a blatant violation of her consumer rights and demanded a detective mediate the transaction immediately. The dispatcher suggested she just buy the whole bag like a normal human instead of starting a legal battle. 5. If you think your life is rough, imagine being the dispatcher who took a call about a sandwich with too much mayonnaise. A woman was so outraged by the condiment ratio at a local deli that she claimed her life was in danger. She wanted the police to document the culinary assault before she had a complete emotional breakdown in the parking lot. 6. Driving under the influence is bad, but reporting your GPS for a felony is just peak stupidity. A man called 911 to complain that his navigation system was disrespecting him by repeatedly recalculating the route. He figured the cops would come and arrest the software, but they ended up arresting him instead for being way too drunk to operate a phone. 7. Some people use 911 for emergencies, while others use it because their favorite TV show was interrupted by a weather alert. A viewer in Alabama called the emergency line to scream about missing the climax of a soap opera due to a tornado warning. Apparently, a fictional romance was way more important to her than the literal destruction of the neighboring town. 8. Imagine calling the cops because your smart thermostat is looking at you weird. A man in Vegas dialed 911 because he was convinced the digital display was blinking in Morse code to leak his search history to the neighbors. He demanded a forensic digital sweep of his living room to neutralize the intelligent threat before he lost his privacy. 9. A person called 911 in a total panic because they found a human ear in their garden that turned out to be a slightly shriveled mushroom. They demanded a homicide investigation and a yellow tape perimeter around their prize-winning petunias. It takes a special kind of imagination to turn a common fungus into a major suburban crime scene. 10. A guy in Connecticut called the emergency line because the local pizza shop wouldn't give him a discount for being a regular customer. He claimed the lack of loyalty rewards was a form of financial abuse and wanted the owner cited. The only thing he actually received was a stern lecture and a permanent ban from the shop. 11. Imagine being so incredibly lazy that you report your own driveway as stolen because it was covered in 6 inches of fresh snow. A man in Minnesota called 911 to demand the police find his pavement and arrest this guy for vandalism. The dispatcher suggested he pick up a shovel instead of a telephone to solve his snowy crime mystery. 12. A woman in Connecticut reached a completely new level of entitlement when she dialed 911 because her Tinder date didn't look exactly like his profile photos. She actually demanded the poor guy be arrested for false advertising and fraud. Apparently, she thought the police department was a premium customer support line for her failing love life and disappointing Friday night. 13. A Florida man called emergency services in a total state of frenzy after a rogue seagull swooped down and snatched the expensive toupee right off his bald head. He demanded that the police track the bird down and recover his hair before it flew too far away. Officers had to inform him that they don't have a specialized unit for avian grand theft or wig recovery. 14. A terrified shopper called 911 because they accidentally ate a suspicious grape at the grocery store and were waiting for the poison to kick in. They demanded a full medical escort and a lab analysis of the fruit bowl immediately. The dispatcher suggested they just drink some water and stop eating things they haven't paid for yet. 15. A woman in California called 911 to report her neighbor for the suspicious act of sunbathing in their very own backyard. She claimed the sight was a direct assault on her eyes and demanded an immediate arrest for public indecency and psychological trauma. The dispatcher had to remind her that simply looking at your neighbor while they enjoy their property is not a crime. 16. A man called the police to report his car had been stolen, only to realize mid-conversation that he had actually sold the vehicle 3 months prior. He had completely forgotten about the transaction and panicked when he saw an empty driveway that morning. It takes a special kind of memory lapse to forget a major financial transaction and the fact that you no longer own a car. 17. A husband in Tennessee called 911 to report his wife for illegal snoring that he claimed was a form of psychological warfare. He actually wanted an officer to come over and serve her an official eviction notice in the middle of the night. The dispatcher suggested he try a guest room instead of starting a legal battle over nasal vibrations. 18. A paranoid homeowner called 911 to report a suspicious bird that had been sitting on his fence and plotting something for over an hour. He was convinced the crow was a government drone sent to monitor his recycling habits. The dispatcher had to remind him that wildlife doesn't usually require a warrant to exist in a public tree. 19. A man in New Jersey called emergency services because he got his finger stuck in a ring and couldn't get it off after several minutes of trying. He demanded that a tactical team come to his house with a power saw to perform an emergency extraction on his kitchen table. The dispatcher suggested he try some dish soap and a little dignity before involving the authorities. 20. One angry citizen dialed 911 because the local post office was closed on Labor Day and he couldn't get inside. He claimed the government was illegally withholding his mail and demanded that an officer break into the building to retrieve a specific package. The dispatcher had to explain how federal holidays and basic logic actually work to the confused and furious man. 21. A woman called the emergency line because her automatic vacuum cleaner was following her from room to room with what she called murderous intent. She was convinced the device had developed a sentient grudge and was planning to trip her on the stairs. The dispatcher had to explain that's literally just how sensors work in a smart home. 22. A woman called the emergency line because the check engine light on her dashboard was glowing red while she was driving. She thought the car was about to explode like an action movie and demanded a police escort to the nearest mechanic. The dispatcher informed her that it was just a maintenance reminder and not a ticking bomb ready to level the block. 23. A disgruntled neighbor called 911 because a group of local kids built a snowman that looked like him in a mocking way. He claimed the frozen figure was an act of public defamation and demanded it be demolished by a tactical team. The dispatcher suggested he just wait for the sun to come out and do the work for him. 24. A man called 911 to ask if an officer could come over and check if his outfit looked good for a first date because he didn't have a mirror. He figured the police were experts in judging uniforms and wanted an official stamp of approval on his tie. The only thing he actually received was a very stern lecture about proper emergency line usage. 25. A woman called 911 because a self-checkout machine insulted her intelligence by repeatedly telling her there was an unexpected item in the bagging area. She wanted the machine arrested for harassment and verbal abuse. The dispatcher suggested she just wait for the human attendant instead of starting a full-scale war with the grocery store robots. 26. A man called the police to report that he had found a prehistoric dinosaur tooth in his backyard and wanted a forensic team to secure the site immediately. Experts arrived only to find a very common and very boring rock that happened to be shaped like a triangle. A little imagination can turn a dusty pebble into a multi-million-dollar scientific discovery. 27. One bizarre caller dialed 911 because they believed their neighbor was stealing their air by using a high-powered industrial fan on their porch. They claimed the fan was creating a localized vacuum that made it physically hard for them to breathe. The dispatcher struggled to explain the basic laws of physics and atmospheric pressure without laughing out loud at the absurdity. 28. A man called 911 because he couldn't find his television remote and wanted the dispatcher to call his cell phone so he could find it. He figured the police had a super signal that could track lost electronics within a 5-mile radius. Sadly, the only thing they tracked down was his long list of unpaid traffic tickets and a warrant for his arrest. 29. Some hauntings are easily explained by basic physics. A man called 911 because he saw a ghostly figure lurking in his yard that disappeared every time he got close. When the police arrived, they discovered he was simply looking at his own reflection in a large puddle on his porch. He had spent 20 minutes stalking himself in the dark. 30. Smart fridges are great until you're convinced they're plotting against you. A homeowner in New York called the emergency line because their refrigerator was making a menacing humming sound that they believed was a countdown to an explosion. They demanded a bomb squad arrive before their milk spoiled. The only thing that actually blew up was the dispatcher's patience. 31. Suburban life can be stressful, but one woman took it to the extreme when she called 911 because her neighbor's sprinkler was slightly misting her driveway. She claimed it was attempted flooding and demanded the fire department arrive immediately to shut off the main water valve before her concrete got too wet. 32. One man called 911 to report a bank robbery because a vending machine didn't give him change for his $5 bill after he bought a bag of chips. He demanded a full investigation into the thieving machine and the arrest of the property owner. The dispatcher suggested he just call the number on the sticker instead of a patrol car. 33. Fast food grievances are a 911 staple, like the customer who called because their fries were dangerously cold and the manager refused to offer a full refund. They insisted this was a case of consumer fraud and demanded a squad car for protection against the lukewarm potatoes. Some people think police are just heavily armed food critics. 34. A terrified hiker called emergency services because a wild deer was staring at them aggressively in a public park. They were fully convinced the animal was about to launch a coordinated tactical attack and demanded an armed escort back to their car. The dispatcher had to explain that deer are generally not known for their combat skills. 35. A man in Florida called emergency services because he was convinced his beard was growing at an illegal speed, and he thought it was a medical anomaly. He wanted an officer to come over and document the growth for a future lawsuit against his barber. The dispatcher informed him that hair growth is a biological process, not a criminal offense. 36. A woman in Florida actually called the police because her best friend didn't like her latest selfie on Facebook. She claimed this was a form of cyberbullying and demanded the friend be taken into custody for emotional distress. It's truly amazing how some people think the Bill of Rights protects them from being ignored online. 37. A woman called 911 to report a grand theft because someone had taken her favorite parking spot on a completely public street. She claimed she had an unwritten deed to the asphalt and demanded the other car be towed immediately. The dispatcher had to explain the basics of public infrastructure to a very confused and angry adult. 38. One man called the police because his magic crystal didn't make him win the lottery like the infomercial promised it would. He claimed he was a victim of a multi-million-dollar fraud and wanted the company's CEO arrested for emotional damages. The dispatcher suggested he save his money for things that actually work, like a job. 39. A person called 911 because their smart speaker refused to play their favorite song and was giving them attitude instead. They wanted an officer to come over and force the device to comply with their vocal commands. The dispatcher informed them that the police are not technical support for people who can't handle a Bluetooth glitch. 40. A man called 911 to complain that his dog wouldn't stop judging his cooking and it was making him feel unsafe in his own kitchen. He demanded that animal control remove the pet for psychological warfare before he finished his dinner. The dispatcher suggested he try following a recipe or just getting a more supportive animal. 41. During a light winter dusting, a woman called the emergency line to complain that the snow in her yard was too bright and giving her a massive headache. She wanted the city to send a crew to spray it with something to dull the reflection. The dispatcher suggested she try wearing sunglasses instead of calling for a municipal intervention. 42. Relationship drama reached a boiling point when a woman in Oregon called 911 because her boyfriend refused to pass the salt during a heated argument at dinner. She claimed this was a form of passive-aggressive domestic abuse and wanted an officer to mediate the meal. The dispatcher's silence was the only logical response to such a petty request. 43. A woman called 911 to report a spy pigeon that was wearing a high-tech camera on its leg. When the police arrived to investigate the avian threat, they found a common racing pigeon with a standard identification band. Apparently, the caller had spent way too much time on weird internet conspiracy forums that morning. 44. One entitled tourist called the emergency line in a coastal town because the public beach was unacceptably crowded and there was no place to put their umbrella. They demanded the police come down and clear out some of the other families so they could have a better view of the ocean. It takes a special ego to call 911 for VIP seating. 45. A man called 911 because the local park had too many trees, and the amount of nature was making it hard for him to navigate back to his car. He demanded a search and rescue team guide him through the dense forest that was actually just a small city block with some oaks. The dispatcher suggested he just follow the sidewalk. 46. An angry commuter dialed 911 because their city bus was 3 minutes late and didn't wait for them at the stop. They demanded a police escort to catch up with the bus so they could yell at the driver. The dispatcher informed them that the police are not a personal chase car for people who can't wake up on time. 47. Hunger can drive people to do crazy things, like the man who called 911 because he couldn't get a jar of pickles open and was starving to death. He asked if an officer with a strong grip could swing by and help him out with the stubborn lid. The dispatcher suggested he try running it under hot water instead. 48. Dealing with a judgy cat is part of pet ownership, but one woman called the emergency line because her feline's expression made her feel unsafe. She demanded the animal be removed by animal control for psychological warfare. Apparently, she didn't realize that being judgmental is literally the primary job description of every single house cat in the world. 49. A caller dialed 911 to report a UFO that was hovering over their house and emitting a strange, multicolored glow. When the police arrived with their guard up, they found a neighbor's kid flying a kite with some cheap LED lights attached to the tail. It turns out the invasion of Earth was just a 10-year-old having some weekend fun. 50. Retail therapy went wrong when a customer called 911 because the cashier refused to accept an expired coupon for 50 cents off laundry detergent. They claimed this was a theft of savings and demanded the store manager be put in handcuffs immediately. The dispatcher suggested they just pay the extra 2 quarters and move on with their life. 51. One deeply offended McDonald's customer called 911 because the ice cream machine was broken for the 3rd time that week. They claimed this was a blatant violation of their civil rights and demanded that the police investigate the staff for intentional emotional sabotage. The dispatcher had to explain that a lack of soft serve is a tragedy, but definitely not a felony. 52. Passive-aggressive suburban warfare reached a peak when a man dialed 911 to complain about his neighbor mowing the lawn at 8 in the morning on a Saturday. He insisted this was a case of sound-based battery and wanted the police to seize the lawnmower. The dispatcher suggested he try some earplugs or a very stern conversation before calling the law. 53. A desperate teenager called the emergency line because their Netflix password stopped working right in the middle of a massive season finale. They were convinced they had been hacked by a foreign government and demanded an immediate cybersecurity intervention. The dispatcher suggested they just talk to their parents about the billing status instead of involving the federal authorities. 54. Losing the lottery is tough, but calling 911 to report the state for rigging the drawing is a whole new level of delusion. One man insisted that his specific numbers were destined to win and demanded a detective investigate the bouncing balls at the headquarters. The dispatcher suggested he save his quarters for a therapist rather than a squad car. 55. A confused homeowner called the police because an Amazon package for their neighbor was accidentally delivered to their porch. They claimed the cardboard box looked menacing and was probably a Trojan horse for a neighborhood invasion. The dispatcher told them to just walk 5 feet to the left and drop it off like a normal human being would. 56. Public pools can be chilly, but one man thought it was a criminal offense and dialed 911 to report the city for negligent freezing. He insisted the water temperature was a torture tactic and demanded the lifeguards be detained. The dispatcher had to remind him that he could simply choose to stay on the dry land instead of calling sirens. 57. Modern problems require modern solutions, but calling 911 because your phone is at 1% battery is just pure insanity. A teenager in Florida begged the dispatcher to send a patrol car with a charger so they wouldn't lose their social media streak. The dispatcher informed them that the police are not a mobile charging service for digital addicts. 58. One terrified adult called 911 to report a biological intruder in their bedroom that turned out to be a single, tiny spider on the ceiling. They demanded a tactical team with a flamethrower to neutralize the threat before they could go to sleep. The dispatcher suggested a rolled-up magazine and a little courage would be much more effective. 59. A dedicated neighborhood watch member called the emergency line to report a suspicious individual who was repeatedly running past his house. It turned out to be a local jogger who had been following the exact same route for 5 years. The dispatcher suggested the caller invest in a hobby that doesn't involve staring out the window with binoculars. 60. Halloween brings out the absolute worst in people, especially the man who called 911 because his neighbor's decorations were too realistic for his comfort. He was convinced a plastic skeleton in a lawn chair was an actual crime victim and demanded a murder investigation. The dispatcher had to explain the concept of seasonal decor to a fully grown man. 61. A person called 911 because they accidentally sat on their own glasses and wanted the police to come over and perform a repair immediately. They claimed that being blind was an emergency, and since the police serve and protect, they should also fix eyewear. The dispatcher suggested they just go to an optometrist instead. 62. One outraged shopper called the police from a grocery store aisle because they found a carton of milk that was 2 days past its expiration date. They demanded the store manager be charged with attempted mass poisoning and wanted the entire dairy section cordoned off. The dispatcher suggested they simply pick a different carton and keep their drama to themselves. 63. Pizza crust thickness is apparently a matter of life and death for some people in this country. A man called 911 because he ordered a deep dish but received a thin crust instead. He claimed this was a betrayal of trust and a fraudulent business practice. The dispatcher informed him that a culinary mistake is a conversation for the manager. 64. Traffic jams are annoying, but one driver thought they were a crime against humanity and called 911 to demand the police fix the lights. He was convinced the city was intentionally keeping him red just to make him late for work. The dispatcher suggested he leave 10 minutes earlier next time and stop treating 911 like a personal valet. 65. A man in a quiet suburb called 911 to complain about his neighbor's political lawn sign, claiming it was inciting a riot in his own mind. He demanded the police remove the sign and cite the neighbor for disturbing the peace. The dispatcher had to explain the First Amendment to a man who was apparently skipping his school classes. 66. Trying to cancel a gym membership is a nightmare, but calling 911 to report the unauthorized monthly fee is just embarrassing. One woman wanted a detective to raid the gym office and get her money back immediately. The dispatcher suggested that maybe she should just call her bank or finally read the contract she signed 2 years ago. 67. One sleep-deprived man called 911 at 5 in the morning to report a noise violation caused by a bird chirping in the tree outside his window. He asked if an officer could come by and relocate the bird to a different neighborhood. The dispatcher informed him that the police do not have jurisdiction over nature or the morning chorus. 68. A man called 911 because his invisible friend was being way too loud during the night and was refusing to leave the guest room. He wanted the police to come over and trespass the imaginary intruder before he lost any more sleep. The dispatcher politely suggested he try a different kind of professional help for his noisy roommate. 69. A hungry student called the emergency line because a vending machine ate their last dollar and didn't dispense a bag of chips. They claimed this was robbery by machine and wanted a squad car sent to the dorm immediately. The dispatcher had to explain that a snack-based financial loss is not a priority for the local precinct. 70. Modern dating is a total battlefield, but one man called 911 because he was shadow banned on a popular dating app. He claimed this was a violation of his right to find love and wanted the company's CEO arrested for emotional damages. The dispatcher suggested he try going outside and meeting people in the real world instead of calling backup. 71. Imagine being so convinced of your neighbor's godlike powers that you actually call the cops to report a secret weather machine. A man in Washington was certain his neighbor was making it rain specifically to ruin his newly washed car and demanded a full tactical raid to seize the device. The dispatcher had to suggest he just check the local forecast before accusing anyone of atmospheric sabotage. 72. One incredibly hangry woman dialed the emergency line in a total rage because the local deli ran out of her favorite sourdough bread and offered rye instead. She claimed this was a targeted hate crime against her personal taste buds and demanded the baker be taken in for questioning immediately. The dispatcher had to clarify that bread inventory is definitely not a matter for the criminal justice system. 73. A person called 911 in a state of absolute shock because they found a single gray hair in their steak at a high-end restaurant. They demanded a forensic team arrive to DNA test the hair and arrest the chef for felony assault. It's truly incredible that some people think the police are basically just heavily armed health inspectors for hire when the service is slow. 74. Some people are so incredibly bad at math that they call the police because a store clerk gave them 2 nickels instead of a dime. One man in Ohio insisted this was a case of grand larceny and demanded a full-scale investigation into the store's accounting practices. The dispatcher suggested he just count to 10 and hang up the phone before an officer arrived to mock him. 75. A frustrated parent called 911 because their rebellious teenager refused to give up the home Wi-Fi password as a form of protest. They wanted an officer to come over and force the kid to hand over the digital keys so they could watch their shows. The dispatcher had to explain that a family internet dispute is a parenting problem, not a reason to deploy the police. 76. One confused citizen called 911 because they saw a bright light in the sky and were convinced it was a Russian spy satellite preparing for an orbital strike. After a quick check, the dispatcher realized the caller was just staring at the planet Venus during a particularly clear night. Apparently, basic middle school astronomy should be a mandatory requirement for owning a smartphone these days. 77. A man in a total panic called the emergency line because he had accidentally dropped his car keys down a storm drain and didn't want to get his hands dirty. He demanded a dive team and a heavy crane to recover them from the sewer immediately. The dispatcher suggested he call a locksmith or buy a strong magnet instead of wasting the city's limited emergency resources. 78. One truly miserable neighbor called 911 to report that the house next door was having a birthday party and the children were laughing too loudly. He claimed the sound of childhood joy was a form of psychological torture and wanted the kids arrested for disturbing the peace. The dispatcher suggested he buy some high-quality earplugs and maybe try finding a soul sometime this decade. 79. A woman called the police from a clothing store because the dressing room mirror made her look slightly wider than she actually was in real life. She claimed the store was using trick mirrors to commit emotional fraud and demanded the manager be cited for a crime. The dispatcher had to explain that personal vanity is not a protected right under the local police department's jurisdiction. 80. A man in a drive-thru called 911 because the employee forgot to put napkins in his bag after he specifically asked for them twice. He claimed this was a violation of international health codes and demanded a patrol car arrive to facilitate a napkin transfer. The dispatcher's reaction was likely a mix of deep professional sighs and a total loss of faith in humanity. 81. One terrified caller dialed 911 to report a ghost in their attic because they heard a strange scratching sound coming from the ceiling at midnight. When the police arrived with flashlights drawn, they found a very fat raccoon that had moved in to escape the cold. It turns out most hauntings can be easily solved with a simple animal trap and a bit of peanut butter. 82. A man called the emergency line because his girlfriend had changed the channel during the middle of his favorite football game without asking. He claimed this was an act of domestic interference and wanted her removed from the premises by force immediately. The dispatcher suggested they either buy a second television or consider a relationship counselor instead of a lawyer and a jail cell. 83. One incredibly lazy individual called 911 because the remote control for their ceiling fan was on the other side of the room and they were too tired to get up. They asked if a patrolling officer could swing by and turn the fan off for them so they could sleep. The dispatcher informed them that the police are not a personal home automation service for the vertically challenged. 84. A woman called 911 to report a suspicious man who was walking a dog that looked exactly like her own pet that had been stolen 5 years ago. It turned out the man had actually purchased the dog from a reputable breeder and had the legal papers to prove it. Some people really need to move on from their past canine traumas and stop stalking random dog owners. 85. A man called the police because a vending machine gave him a Diet Coke instead of a regular one and refused to give him his dollar back. He claimed the machine was intentionally stealing from the public and demanded a full criminal inquiry into the soda company. The dispatcher suggested he just drink the diet soda and spend some time rethinking his life choices. 86. One panicked homeowner called 911 because they saw a man in a ghillie suit lurking in the thick woods behind their house. It turned out to be a local hunter who was perfectly legal and was just waiting for a deer to walk by. The caller was convinced it was a professional assassin, but the only thing being targeted that day was a 4-point buck. 87. A woman in a restaurant called 911 because her soup was too hot and she had accidentally burned the tip of her tongue on the first spoonful. She demanded that the police arrest the waiter for serving a hazardous material without a bright red warning label. The dispatcher had to explain that most people usually just blow on their food before eating it like adults. 88. One confused driver called 911 because they couldn't figure out how to put their new electric car into park and were rolling slowly through a crowded parking lot. They wanted a police escort to stay in front of them until the battery finally ran out. The dispatcher suggested they try looking for a button or just pulling the emergency brake like a normal person. 89. A woman called the police because her neighbor's menacing lawn gnome was looking at her house with evil intent every time she walked to her car. She demanded that the police seize the ceramic figure as a weapon of psychological trauma. The dispatcher had to explain that inanimate objects generally don't have criminal motives or facial expressions. 90. One angry neighbor called 911 because the person across the street was washing their car on a Sunday, which they claimed was a violation of local religious customs. They wanted the car owner arrested for blasphemy and illegal water usage on the Sabbath. The dispatcher had to explain that washing a Honda is not a sin in the eyes of the American legal system. 91. A guy in Florida called 911 because he was convinced his own shadow was stalking him and moving slightly faster than his actual body. He demanded a police escort to his psychiatrist's office for protection from his own dark silhouette. The dispatcher had to suggest he just walk into a completely dark room and see if the problem disappeared on its own. 92. One incredibly petty homeowner dialed the emergency line because their neighbor's cat had the audacity to stare at them through the window for over 20 minutes. They claimed the feline was gathering intelligence for a future burglary and wanted it detained for questioning. Apparently, being judged by a cat is now considered a high-level security threat in the suburbs. 93. A person called 911 because they forgot their own birthday and were certain someone had stolen their identity and replaced their age. They demanded a full investigation into the time theft and wanted their birth certificate verified by a forensic team. The dispatcher suggested they just check their driver's license and take a deep breath. 94. Imagine being so confused by technology that you call 911 because you can't figure out how to hang up a FaceTime call with your ex. A woman in Texas begged the dispatcher to remotely disconnect her phone before she said something she'd regret. The dispatcher informed her that the police department doesn't double as a relationship exit strategy or tech support. 95. One hungry genius called 911 to complain that his local Chinese restaurant didn't include enough soy sauce packets with his massive takeout order. He claimed this was a breach of contract and demanded an officer facilitate a fair trade for more sodium. The dispatcher's soul probably left their body while explaining that salt levels aren't a matter for the authorities. 96. A man called the emergency line because he saw a giant orange ball of fire in the western sky and thought the world was ending. The dispatcher had to patiently explain that he was simply witnessing a sunset for the first time in his sheltered life. It's terrifying that people who don't understand the solar system are allowed to operate heavy machinery and vote. 97. A woman in North Carolina called 911 because her husband refused to give her a foot massage after a long day of shopping. She claimed this was a form of domestic neglect and wanted him cited for failing to meet her emotional needs. The dispatcher suggested she hire a professional masseuse instead of wasting the time of people dealing with actual crimes. 98. One angry roommate dialed 911 because their friend used the expensive shampoo without asking and refused to pay the replacement cost. They demanded a theft report be filed and the roommate be evicted on the spot for hair care-related crimes. The dispatcher reminded them that a civil dispute over soap is not a reason to activate a squad car. 99. A confused man called the police to report that his house had been stolen while he was at work, only to realize he had driven to the wrong street. He was screaming about grand larceny until he noticed his neighbor's lawn gnomes were missing, and his key actually worked in the door. Talk about a peak main character moment of pure stupidity. 100. A man once called 911 because he wanted to know the secret recipe for a perfect beef stew, and figured the dispatcher would have a lot of free time to chat. He claimed it was a hunger emergency, and he needed culinary guidance immediately. The dispatcher suggested he try Google or a cookbook before they sent an officer to arrest him for misuse. 101. The ultimate prize for stupidity goes to the man who called 911 to ask for the non-emergency phone number because he didn't want to bother anyone. He spent 5 minutes explaining how he wanted to be respectful while simultaneously blocking the actual emergency line for people with real heart attacks. The irony was completely lost on him, but not on the dispatcher. That's 101 reasons why the human race might be a failed experiment. Seriously, if you aren't currently on fire or being chased by a guy with a chainsaw, put the phone down and figure it out yourself. Which one of these geniuses deserves a life sentence of no internet for their stupidity? Drop your favorite in the comments. If you enjoyed watching the decline of civilization, hit that subscribe button and like the video. Or don't, and let your shadow stalk you. See ya.